This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
So this is a session on war and peacekeeping, and the first speaker will be Ben Morris, and his title is Participant Interviewer. And Ben has had a busy life. He graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1965 and retired from the Army in 1974. He served with a number of infantry units, which included operational service in Vietnam. In 1983, he joined the Army Reserve. He joined the Commonwealth Public Service and worked in the Department of Health, Defence and then at the Australian Taxation Office. And also in 1983, he graduated from the Australian National University with a Bachelor of Economics. In 1993, he gained a Master of Taxation from the University of New South Wales. So he's currently enrolled in a Master of Arts at Wollongong University, and his research is based on oral histories of Vietnam veterans. Ben has contributed over 30 articles to publications including the Defence Journal, the Oral History Association of Australian Journal, Voice Print, Church, Regimental and Veterans magazines. He's presented papers at the OHAA's Biennial National Conferences in Launceston and Melbourne, the Australian Historical Association Conference held at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and the 16th International Oral History Association Conference in Prague in Czechoslovakia. So his papers include Anzac, Legend, Myth, Reality, The Commander's Diary, The Participant Interviewer in Vietnam War Oral Histories. His paper, Permission to Speak, Sir, given at the 26th Conference in Prague, was published in the 2010 Oral History Association Journal. So I'll hand you over to Ben.
All right, this afternoon I want to talk about the participant interviewer. That's not me, that's Sonny. Anyway, technology, what did we do before we had it? We just spoke. How long does it take the elastic bands to wind up? Oh, there they are. That's who I am militarily, and I need to explain that this paper is about 19 of the 33 soldiers I commanded in Vietnam. Now, one of the things I've learnt to do one of the things I've learnt to do when someone mentions that they're a Vietnam veteran is to look them up on this roll, because I'll explain why in a minute. But if you put my name in, you come up with 169 names, 9 pages of Morris's served in Vietnam. Sorry, I keep wandering away from that. If we go back and you put my surname in, like someone did, they put Ben in for the next one, and what do you get? No veteran record found. They were going to out me on the wannabe site. You know, I'm one of these wannabes. But if you do it this way, is that ASIO or racist? You do it this way, bingo, you found me. And someone suggested the person they should go and look for E.B. Morris instead of just B. Morris. Now, the reason why I did this, because I presented a paper to be peer review, and one of the issues that one of the peer reviewers got all upset about was the wannabes. Now, the group that I'm dealing with are definitely not wannabes. I have helped to fill out their records, and I have gone back a couple of times to check various parts, not only on the Vietnam veterans' nominal roll, but also their personal record. Because this is the problem we've got. And blokes like this Hines character who ended up in court and he's been declared a fraud. Now, even worse still was this fellow that managed to get $700,000 out of the government. Now, as oral historians, those two things don't worry us. But what really does worry us is that these people put the whole of oral history under a question mark. And if you look in Paul Ham, around page 365 to 635 to 638, you will see the senior officers getting stuck into the soldiers that you can't believe their word. So if you're doing anything with military people, not only Vietnam veterans, you can look anyone else up, First World War, Second World War, they're all on these nominal rolls these days. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to find everyone. I've got one soldier in my platoon I can't find because, as he said to me when he refused to do an oral history, I only talk about Vietnam on 2 days, Anzac Day and Long Tan Day, and the rest of the year I want nothing to do with it, and he's asked for his name to be removed from the roll. So, you know, it's not an absolute foolproof, but it does help. Anyway, I want to talk about the participant interview and not the general stuff, because as my wife says, I love talking about the soldiers. It's very easy to remain in the third person and record things like that. But as a participant interviewer, I've got to come back and look in the first person. Now, one of the big problems I had with doing oral histories is that officers do not fraternise with their soldiers. And it's not a new thing. If you read Alistair's book on pages 7 and 8, he talks about the same thing, where he went off to the officers' mess, and the only time he ended up playing with their soldiers' children was when his parents were away and they were babysitting. So that distinction between officers and soldiers runs fairly deep. And the armies have been unforgiving of people who go across that line. So that was one of the first things that ran deep when I started to look at this whole issue. Now, it wasn't new because Anzac Day brings up the same problem. Do you do what I did for a while and go off and drink with the officers and the Royal Australian Regiment Association executive and everything like that? Or do you go and drink with your diggers? And so this is an issue that's running behind all of it, and it's an issue that I'm having a lot of problems of pulling out when I'm writing about it. Now, one thing I decided that, well, my project started about 2004 when I'm sitting alongside a pool on Bribie Island, and I was sick of hearing this Vietnam veteran complain that the record was wrong. So I said, Brian, I've got some tape recorders in there, let's start taping. And I did 1 or 2 tapes after that. And then when Paul Ham's book came out, I had a fella on the phone complaining that Ham had got an injury to one of the soldiers wrong. And he expected me to do something about it. So this is part of what I'm doing. So I went off and I started visiting the soldiers in their homes. Now, accepting home invitations reduces the cost. That's the first thing. Allows additional time to finish, because every veteran I have interviewed has got the time wrong. And I have a bit on occasions too. And part of my plan was that I didn't want to push the finish. And quite often the real interesting stuff comes up in the last little bit. I'm sure other people agree with me on that. It leaves the narrator in familiar surroundings. The vice versa of that is that I'm in unfamiliar circumstances. Now, some of the problems that can occur with this, if the interview becomes tense, you're on their ground, you're not on your ground, or you're not on neutral ground. If there's a disagreement, and I'll talk more about that a little later on. Withdrawal of invitation, well, that didn't happen at any stage because I made sure that if I stayed somewhere that I was likely to be able to spend the night there and not have to find or be homeless on the street amongst all those veterans that were being talked about earlier today in California that are on the street. The other thing that does loom large is family opposition to anything to do with the war, because the family is suffering fallout, and often long after father has ceased to worry about things, the wife and the kids have got to walk on eggshells and keep things going. So in some ways I'm walking into the lion's den. Now, I didn't have a real problem with it, and I could tell you lots of stories of what happened when I met the partner, met the wife, introduced to all the kids. You're constantly being drawn into the family circle. So therefore you have to drop all the military stuff. And as Paul Thompson says in his book, you've got to go and sit at the feet of your interviewees, your narrators. And for someone who spent 4 years learning to be an officer in training, that ain't easy, I can tell you that. And I had to keep checking myself all the time that I couldn't give commands or give orders anymore. I had to sit there and listen. Now, in these interviews, there's a number of things that came out. There were myths. There was an outright refusal. There was one person who was really critical of me, but I'd been a bit smart. I hadn't decided to stay overnight with him, or I hadn't got an invitation from him actually, which I wasn't expecting anyway. And then composure. Now, coming back to the myths, soldiers live by myths. That doesn't mean that their history is wrong or incorrect, but the myths keep feeding in all the time. And this was one thing that I had to stop and think about. The Anzac legend runs behind all Australian military history. Now, one of the myths I came up against were these people who'd volunteered for Vietnam. There are only two lots of people that went to Vietnam, and I won't go in too deeply. I've got an article in, I hope it will be published, where either the national servicemen called up under the 1964 National Service Act, who legally were required to go where the army wanted them to go. The other group, yes, they may have volunteered to join the army, but after that point they were subject to the Defence Act 1965 and had to go where they were told. So this was one story, and I'm sitting there and this bloke's telling me I'm a volunteer, and I'm trying to keep a straight face and not jump up and down and pin him to the wall and say, hey, hang on, your regimental number is definitely a national service man's one, because there's 7 figures, the second figure is 7, that identifies you as a national serviceman, and how can you call yourself a volunteer? The other big myth that I ran into was the welcome home. Because this battalion did march through the streets of Brisbane after they returned home. But again, I'll stay away from that at the moment. I'll write a paper on that later on because it's very interesting why these veterans claimed they weren't welcome home. And that's why they went for this big parade in 1983. But in some ways, that again was tapping back into the Anzac legend. I've got 5 minutes, have I? Righto. In my interviews, I had one bloke who did refuse to discuss the subject. And in fact, all of them told the nice story, right? They ran it along. And I had to ask the question. So if I wasn't a participant, I wouldn't have known some of the questions to ask. Anyway, this fella, point blank, said, no. I'm sitting there doing an imitation of a goldfish, trying to think what I should do. So I did a real bastard act, I suppose. I asked him about one of the blokes that died. So for 10 minutes he told that story, and he gets to the point where he farewelled the guy as he put him on a helicopter, and he broke down. And that was my opportunity. In that break, I got stuck in here and said, I want you to talk about that incident. And it might have been a bit like that. Anyway, we get back on the tape. Yeah, he talked about that incident. Why he would not talk about that incident. And he's addressing me in the third person. I thought, hey, I'm not in this bloody room. Anyway, that's some of the things. I had a fellow that, as I said, was very critical of me. But initially, on the interview, It was a perfect training manual of how to set up to go to war, how to go to war, and the deficiencies of a couple of his peers. But nothing personal about him. And in fact, I walked out and the fellow that refused me had driven me from Glasshouse Mountain to Tin Can Bay and was taking me on to Munberg. I walked out and he said, "You and Hines have a fight?" And I said, "Nah." He said, "He's upset you." And I said, "Maybe." He said, "Well, you're not to ambushing," which led me to think, did I go around ambushing my soldiers when they didn't do what I wanted them to do? And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you're a pretty good ambusher." And I said, "Yeah, righto." Anyway, this fella trotted out a terrible lot of things, but it was written. He wouldn't say it to my face. Anyway, the other thing is there a difference when both the interviewee and the interviewer haven't got composure about events? And having not got that composure, you can talk about those things that you haven't got composure, and the other bloke knows it, and he's able to talk about it. Whereas if someone else, they'd be dodging that particular issue. Sorry, I've really got into this. The conclusions. These interviews, for me, did a lot. Now, I had a discussion with two people last night. Is oral history therapy or not? Maybe. But what we're interested in is in the history. And most of these blokes I interviewed wouldn't have got to start if we'd put some of Alistair's criteria that he used for his big project, because most of them are undergoing some form of therapy or treatment, a number, and there's something like 25 in the 33 have got TPIs. And I can't remember exactly who amongst the 19 have them or haven't. I know two of them that haven't, but the majority of the others have. Do we ignore people who've got mental health problems? And that's some of the issues that I've had to look at. And my thing is, I bat them off. I'm not your therapist. I'm not a medical professional. Here's the number for BVCS. Ring them up and talk to them. And most of them have. And maybe that's one of the things that's come out of these interviews, is the fact that they have. And the last thing, finally, I'd say that doing oral histories does help you when the family come to you and ask you to do an obituary at a funeral. You have a stack of information, right? Your biggest problem is working out what you should say. And one family laid it down very strictly. I was only to speak for 5 minutes for a fellow who'd given me a 3-hour oral history, so I had a mass of stuff. But I knew I'd hit the right story when I'm telling something he'd told me, and I saw the family who'd all been in tears suddenly smiling because I'd found the right story. And as I said, I think they have helped me. Thank you.